Nice to have you all here in the task force meeting. So I will just say hello because Sébastien Treillet will take over in a second. And so we hope really for a very fruitful debate, talking a bit, give you a bit of an idea of our chair's ideas. And then, of course, there's ample of room for you also to give us a very short cut of your ideas. And then we get together again. So I hand over to Sebastian. And again, let's have a nice 1 hour chat. Please.
Thank you very much, Christian. I hope you can hear me well. So what I will try to do in 10 minutes is to give you an overview of how we've tried to arrange a series of messages based on some of the policy briefs that have been submitted by task force members, but not all of them. And that's why we have a second part of the session where the task force members who have submitted a policy brief can also present their main messages. I'm just struggling with just remembering that what we are the relevance of what we are working on is particularly aiming at the G7 presidency priority on investing in a better future that encompasses two quite broad subjects. One is investing for sustainable development, and in particular in infrastructure, and the second on improving the institutions of global cooperation. And so you see the spread of policy briefs over these two main topics, and I will focus mainly, our chair's policy brief will focus mainly on the first point. What you will see, what I try to present is a PowerPoint that is still work in progress, but I will try to get the most important issues. So first, the challenge is that investing in sustainable development, particularly in global South country, is a very big challenge, but we have a lack of credibility of G7 countries halfway of the Agenda 2030. This reminds us of the Gleneagles moment of 2005, but the relative power of G7 countries is much smaller. We also have a flawed heritage of the high-profile G7 or G8 commitments in that regard, and there is an exacerbation of distrust between Global South and G7 countries. And of course, Agenda 2030 is a very complex policy terrain that makes the whole very complicated. What we insist on is that G7 countries have an outsized role to play in the multilateral, but also in other international financing mechanisms in order to reach Agenda 2030. And their role is to update, scale up, and finance those mechanisms. The other point on which we would like to insist is that Agenda 2030 is very complex, very important, and very urgent in terms of the transformation it entails. Despite war and conflict, investing in Agenda 2030 is more important than ever for Southern countries, but also strategically for G7 countries, because it really represents the Global South needs in the current period, and where the economic downturn is particularly important after the series of crises. 2023 will be a critical moment because we will consider how far we are from the track to reach SDGs, and also from mobilizing the necessary resources. So we will in that part recall main issues about achieving SDGs that is universal, and that we have a lack of SDG alignment in both private and public and northern and southern countries. The main issues are the alignment of domestic budgets with SDG outcomes. This is still not, including within G7 countries, this is still not the case. We have shortfalls in North-South funding instruments, and also underinvestment in global commons in general. So this is the type of issues that we are putting the emphasis on, is that innovations are needed both in G7 countries and in their support to other countries. And this is why the proposals that we are coming to are the following. Sorry, I'm struggling with all the windows on my screen to be able to read what I want to read. So what we think there is a very important role of G7, and in particular this year, to support Agenda 2030, leadership role of G7 countries on the alignment, on SDG alignment of finance, both public and private. There has been work done since the French G7 presidency by OECD and UNDP, and the Italian G20 presidency also insisted on that. G7 countries and their development institutions have a very important role to play given the size that they have in global ODA. Of course, there is an issue of both alignment of public and private finance, but also to ensure that the overall amount that is available is at the size of the funding challenge. And for that, we would propose that G7 countries need to support innovative funding sources. For instance, as we've seen for instance, in other T20 task forces on a tax on financial transactions. But also what G7 countries could really push forward is illustration of good practices in terms of alignment of public and private banks. The idea pushed forward by John MacArthur of the 17 rooms that are a way to materialize, operationalize the alignment with Agenda 2030, the integrated national financing framework for sustainable developments, where governments can also show their alignment. And we have a specific policy brief that particularly targets SDG domestic budget tagging. Sorry, I think I was still trying to particularly also emphasize the role of public development banks, national, but also multilateral ones. And this is where G7 public development banks, bilateral development banks, but also G7 countries as shareholders of MDBs could push for alignment. A specific focus on infrastructure is needed because that's one of the key priorities of the presidency. What we propose in this issue paper is to deframe from just the issue of the focus on infrastructure to have a look at the global discussion on Agenda 2030 financing. But of course, infrastructures are extremely important and strategic. Important because they are at the heart of some of the needs of developing countries, of southern countries, but also because the G7 countries and the way they can be at the heart of the definition of norms and standards for sustainable infrastructure, this is going to be strategic compared to other countries. And we would propose there to really look at infrastructures in a large meaning. I think that's what the Global Gateway Initiative is also looking at, not just energy, but also, for instance, including digital. We need to define the key added value of sustainability alignment for quality infrastructure, and in particular, that it does not represent an extra cost, but an investment in long term, and that it's not just going to slow down financing of infrastructure, but that it can lead to rapid action. And we would add what the G7 countries also insist on is the fact that if you look at the Agenda 2030 in its overall meaning, there is the emphasis also on protection of privacy and of democratic space, as in, for instance, the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or in the governance issues of the ESG framework. So coming just to my final points on implementation, our advice is that the German G7 presidency would need to prepare with the upcoming Japanese G7 presidency, the 2023 political discussion on the 2030 agenda, because we are at risk that we just look at the gap to the objective rather than at solutions. And there are a series of meetings, and in particular meetings on financing climate or financing development and sustainable development that are happening in Africa, in Morocco, in Ivory Coast, and in Egypt. And of course, this is, as advised by another policy brief, the G7 should not just act on its own, but with G20 presidencies. And there are a series of pitfalls or traps that we need to be looked at within G7 countries, for instance, with the USA, who are not on board of Agenda 2030 for the moment. Discussion also on sustainable infrastructure standards with China, the need for G7 compact with Africa. And here you see I mentioned some of the policy briefs on the USA or on Africa that are specifically tackling how the G7 could work with them. And the last point is that we also see that China has already transitioned its discourse from infrastructure towards the partnership with Africa on productive investments and trade, which of course means that G7 countries should not only look at infrastructure, but also at these issues of productive investments, innovation, and supply chain arrangements. So I think that's what I had to present about our issue paper, and I hope I was not too long. Thanks a lot.
So, okay, so this would be our proposal. So it's still not still not, it's not in very early stage, but this is where we would like going for in a principle. And of course, we stand ready now to answer to questions or maybe to hints that we can take up on board. And of course, this is not the final show here. So it's just the idea to bring this forward to you. And we would right now just collect some initial advice. I have already seen there are some of you have already written in the chat. And of course, we will look very closely to the chat afterwards and see where we can take on board, or where we will probably also establish a bilateral contact with you and your teams in case. And I just wanted also to add that, of course, we plan it in the way that we will, along the lines of our chair's paper, we will, of course, take on board in several possibilities, of course, what is in the policy papers you will present. So I can imagine two main routes. One route would be that we entirely take an element of your policy paper on board as this fits in our flow. But also we would, of course, do, if this is a bit within this area, but it's not in the current flow, we would nevertheless like in our chair paper also to highlight then issues which are closely connected with the subject. So we will have probably these two parts, but again, we stand ready to get in touch with you, or you can just get in touch with us three to talk about that. And so we can arrange for that in the next days. So this is how we would proceed. So, and if you like, again, please use the chat. And of course, please raise your hand if you want to have an immediate reaction. I would first call on the task force members here, and then I would also open it up for those who are just guests and for advice. And I think as we are a bit limited in time, we can arrange that for, I guess, so say 10 minutes. And then I would also like to give you the chance also to present to the Global Solutions Summit audience the really top issues, ideas of your policy papers. I think this is also the day for that. So without further ado, anybody who wants to speak up immediately?
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this is Colin Bradford.
Hey, Colin.
Yes, greetings to you all. I'm glad to see this session, and Alan and I have put something in the chat that we've been working on both the SDGs and in relation to China. I mean, there's great concern in Washington. There's been a good brief done by Tony Pippa and others at Brookings on describing the US relations to the SDGs, and it's appallingly weak. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know. I think the G7 is precisely the forum within which for the Europeans and even Canadians and Japanese to, I see Shumi's here, is to really push the US to commit to this in international development cooperation, if not domestically, which it also fits the Biden priorities, by the way. So domestically is what I mean. So there should be political valence for the US to do this. And the second piece, which I know is complicated, but I don't know the details of, and I ask this in a genuine way, not in a critical way, is relations with China are tricky, to say the least. That's what we've been focusing on ourselves. But give China credit. China has been since 2016, when it chaired the G20, fully behind the SDGs. And so, a global effort to do the SDGs, it's a good convergence point for the West with China. But I don't know what the institutional framework is for this, because I know the DAC very well from my own government experience. And, I know there's been great effort by Angel Gurria and so on to relate to China across the board, but also in this. So others here will know more than I. And these are two genuine questions. How do you bring the two big players, the US and China, into this game that's so important to do, because it embodies the aspirations of the globe at this moment? Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Colin. I think we collect Sebastian and then we do it in together, but an important aspect. And of course, this is not an easy task as we do not have, say, the same understanding of these approaches. So the next in line would be Georgios, please.
Yeah. Interesting points, but I wanted to know whether you have thought of complementarities. I think the previous speaker also mentioned that. For example, Japan already has a partnership with Africa and has the TCAT conferences, etc. Or the European Union has announced the Global Gateway. How are they all fitting together in a joint package? And if the G7 now announce something more, would that be additional or? And what kind of infrastructure? Also with China, there should be complementarity, exactly as Colin said before, because the recipient end, the countries, they cannot have parallel roads or whatever, parallel systems. They shouldn't, because the donors so think that they want to advertise themselves. And how the people also, not the governments only, feel the presence of the G7 in a positive way in their lives, the benefits therefore for the public. And also, finally, the approach to ODA and all that, because often ODA is the European Union or the US pay their own citizens to advise others what to do, and there isn't much added value or left resources or expertise in the recipient country. Is there any rethinking done on that aspect of it?
Thank you, Georgios. I think they're very, very important aspects. And indeed, this has also a close link to the China question, because there are different philosophies in attitudes towards investing in the global south. And is it about self-empowering, or is it more about getting scarce resources on something like that? And we try to allude a bit into our papers, but Sebastian will for sure come back also on that in a bit more detail. He is the infrastructure man. But first of all, now it's Alan, please.
Oh, well, thanks very much. I just want to follow in a little bit behind Colin's comments. As you're aware, the chairs, he and I and a colleague of ours did a policy brief, and it is, I suspect, partly reflective. But I do want to emphasize, you know, that your kind of collective effort really does focus in part on national initiatives, not, you know, so not just G7, but really national efforts are required here. And of course, it's partly what Colin and I and many have picked up is the lack of real support at the national level, that is the US level. There's very, you know, almost never do the main policy figures in the United States talk about Agenda 2030 or the SDGs, and we need to raise that in this brief. And then additionally, and I'll be quiet after this, is, you know, we have to also recognize the value and importance of the subnational level and identify that. In our policy brief, we picked up on Anne-Marie Slaughter and her colleagues' view on impact hubs, right? The reason for doing that is that it links up the subnational to the national levels. And I think it's very important that we see this as a whole of government, whole of society kind of effort, and not just, you know, nice slogan, Agenda 2030, blah, 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 and we move on. I think, you know, we want to be more pointed about how important we think achieving the SDGs is. And needless to say, the United States was at the forefront in 2015. But the problem is it's not there now. And we need to raise that.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much, Ellen. I think you are very right. So it's a multilateral exercise, but it's of course most of all also aligning the countries, and especially it's important also on subnational levels. Of sure, different federal systems. I do not need to tell you that, but different policy and policy. So let's see. But for sure, that's right. And I think we will also touch on all of that. I think this is at least what we have in our paper right now. So I just think, or we just think that the multilateral level, especially maybe also using new tools, would also be a nice addendum to this entire force we have to try to bring forward in the national countries. And of course, we are very aware that the US Biden is not Trump, but there is a certain restriction too much out of America. Let's see whether the Ukraine event also builds a road to see that this is on top very important in containing the actual development. So I stop here. I see no more hands up. So I would quickly hand over to Sebastian. Want to like to react quickly?
Basically to say thank you for all these comments. I think we have good materials in particularly in the policy briefs to emphasize more the subnational dimension. We received also a paper on cities that is going in the same direction, the role of cities for Agenda 2030. I think nevertheless a part of the discussion is that we will have to acknowledge until next year that, for instance, France is taking Agenda 2030 very seriously for external action, but not at all domestically. And that this type of schizophrenia will not change in 1 year. So push France and national governments to make more domestically, but also use the capital that they have in terms of external action and their alignment with Agenda 2030. So try to push them to be very clear about that. On the US level, I think I had personally no clue, but was referring to a policy brief that some of you have produced. And I think the subnational action is going to be extremely important. And then on China, this is probably the part on which we will have to make proposals to be discussed with you further. Also in the evolving crisis that we see, the G20 being probably not stalled, but stuck in the geopolitical discussions. I personally completely concur with you that we need, that China is a champion of SDGs, that the European are also to some extent, the Japanese and Canadian also, and we need to play with China in that part. This is extremely clear, and not just compete with China. Last point, I hear from you a lot of questions about why do we need a specific G7 initiative on infrastructure. And this is also my question. And I think that's why we propose to reframe the whole discussion about Agenda 2030 and the key milestones of 2023. We will try to send the draft PowerPoint as early as possible to the BMZ to try and understand why they insist so much on infrastructure as an initiative. I mean, that's why what we want to. So if we want to reframe their presidency priority ahead of the Ministerial for Development mid-May, then this is really probably already too late, but this is my last reaction. Thank you so much.
So I also completely agree with that, Sebastian. Really, it's an interesting question, and we will be in touch with the people. So that's fine. So we can close this part of our task force meeting. I would just, is there anybody from outside of the task force crowd here who might also offer a view or a quick idea? So then I wait for a second. But this does not look like, but again, there is always the written possibility to send us your ideas, your views in written form. I think it's easily to approach the task forces or the chairs. So then I would move to our next item, which is then, of course, we would offer now for you 2-3 minutes. Please. I will look to the watch, but who wants to present the policy paper right now here for the Global Solutions community? Please then also raise your hand, and I will take on board. So Ronja, please.
Thank you, Christian. I'm just getting off my mask. I'm also here at the Global Solutions Summit. So hello from Berlin to everyone else. So I have the opportunity to present a paper that I've written with 5 great co-authors. I will paste them in the chat in a minute, along with a link to the actual paper, which is called the G7 in Times of Aggression: Maintaining and Strengthening Cooperative and Inclusive Approaches for the Global Common Good. So we really looked at the top level of multilateral cooperation in these difficult times. Our core argument is that Putin's war in Ukraine is first and foremost a really heartbreaking disaster for the people affected, but at the same time, it jeopardizes global efforts to address humanity's common challenges that unfortunately do not go away. So our call to the G7 is that they shouldn't throw overboard the original agenda, but continue working on the 5 priorities that the German presidency has rolled out, namely sustainable planet, economic stability and transformation, healthy lives, investment in a better future, and stronger together. And our 2 broad recommendations, I'll be very brief, are first to invest in multilateral cooperation and strengthen specifically the more inclusive global governance approaches, so not the club governance, but the inclusive global governance, for instance, by future-proofing the UN, by developing greater strategic foresight, by putting weight behind WTO reform, by ensuring equitable recovery from the various crises, and also by investing in digital cooperation in liaison with ongoing efforts at UN level. And then the second main recommendation is to improve plurilateral and multi-stakeholder formats in times when the inclusive governance formats might be too slow to respond. And this could be achieved by making the Climate Club effective and legitimate, importantly, by activating the somewhat dormant Alliance for Multilateralism, by carefully navigating interlinkages with the G20, and finally also by supporting an effective UN hub for partnerships with non-state actors. So in short, this is really about not losing sight of the challenges that continue to affect the whole world. And it is about using the G7's clout for addressing them together with various partners. And I'll stop here. I see some of my co-authors also in the audience, and we're very happy to answer any questions about this. Thanks.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ronja, for that overview. And I guess there's also the possibility for colleagues here to use then the chat directly to the team. And so, Ronja, do you want to come back for a second? No, okay.
Sorry.
So, but it's very, very interesting. So, and as Olaf Scholz yesterday alluded to some of the issues you just brought along, so especially also how to make more use of this climate club, which is still in its infancy. So this might really be interesting also to use additional interesting tools like foresight and so on. So I love that. But next in the row is, I guess, Caroline was next, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Sebastian and Christian, for the interesting presentation and the insights into the issue paper. My name is Caroline Spanhaus. I'm also here in Berlin from the Global Perspectives Initiative, and I'm here with my colleague Nora Kifa, who's also among the co-authorship of our paper. And our policy brief centers around Africa's limited representation in multilateral organizations and global decision-making processes. The continent has too weak a voice in key areas that impact its development. To remedy this, we call for a G7 partnership with Africa, analogous to the G20 compact with Africa. The 3 central pillars in our brief are health, climate, and business-related policies. They all have in common disproportionality. Africa contributes 4% to the world economy, but holds 19% of the global population. Africa needs to import more than 90% of its medical equipment. Furthermore, even though Africa produces less than 3% of global emissions, it already spends up to 9% of its GDP on adaptation measures. We propose including African forms of knowledge production and policymaking into multilateral bodies and decision-making processes. AU bodies need to be included in international expert panels, for example, the One Health panel. Also, we feel we need to link entrepreneurial investments to the green transition in a way that does not sacrifice Africa's various development agendas. African governments are asking for support in the fields of digital readiness and financial inclusion. Productive entrepreneurship is an engine of prosperity, especially in a leapfrogging continent like Africa. We believe that key is working with rather than on behalf of African countries. Policies that affect Africa need to be in line with countries' national development plans and form synergies with existing national approaches. This calls for the establishment of a T7 Africa Standing Group. Furthermore, we suggest the continuous presence of an AU representative at any forum dedicated to the creation of policy making related to Africa, similar to the EU presence that's already there in multilateral decision-making processes that affect Europe. In summary, we call for a seat at the table for Africa in the same way. Thanks. And I'm also happy to distribute our paper to anyone who's interested or post it in the chat and answer any more questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think, yeah, very well taken. Of course, they should have a seat, and of course, it should be adapted to specific needs. There is no one size fits all, and this is also sometimes forgotten, and you really highlight that point. So the next here is Claudia, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I also want to present our policy brief, which is called WTO 2.0, making the multilateral trading system fit for the 21st century and how the G7 can help. I think some of the co-authors are also in the call, but I would like to mention them first. It's Stormy Mildner from ESM Institute, Clara Brandi from DIE, Anja von Moltke from UNEP, Marianne Schneider-Petzinger from Chatham House, Jeffrey Scott from PIIE, and Davide Tettori from ISPI. We analyzed the challenges that the WTO is facing, and there are more challenges than actually good things that are working. And the first point that we made is what can the G7 do to help, because they're no longer sufficient to propose WTO reform, but we thought they could be lead by example, coordinate their views also with the G20 and other countries, and help capacity building if there are problems. Then we added recommendation in a step-by-step approach. That is, we started with priorities in the run-up to MC12, which will take place in June, and afterwards other priorities that the G7 should start to tackle. And I would just mention them really briefly, and maybe my co-authors would like to add. So we started, I think, as we all did, with the Ukraine. And the first thing that we recommend is avoid new export barriers as reaction to Russia's war on Ukraine. This does not include sanction. This is more about food security. The second point, the way towards an agreement on fisheries. We also suggest to put the SDGs at the core of WTO reform, and the fisheries is one of the first multilateral agreements that has the SDG as its core. And we also suggest in general that the WTO, in order to be reformed, it cannot just go back to the old ways, should address the current challenges that the world is facing. And this is development, environment, and health challenges. And this is also how we proceed with the recommendations. So beyond MC12, establish a greater focus on sustainability. We have several proposals on fossil fuel subsidies or the environmental goods agreement, circularity. Let me just be brief. Then update rules for digital trade. We think this is really important for modern trade. Tackle negative spillover of state intervention. Integrate special and differential treatment provisions in new agreement. And then we have more proposals on monitoring and dispute settlement. The last point we see as a huge problem, because even though we think the G7 can lead by example and propose a lot of the reforms, we believe that the United States is not interested in reforming the dispute settlement system. So we just basically say, okay, we need an open and frank dialogue, which is possible in the context of the G7. But basically, to sum up, is the WTO needs to tackle the challenges, and SDG is one, development, health, and environmental are others. So maybe my co-authors would like to add.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. Nice overview. Trade issues are really very, very complicated. So I remember them at my OECD times. Oh God, I was not the director for trade, but very well taken. But now we have another nice director, and we have seen her today here on the show. Okay, so then I go to Benjamin.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Benjamin Etzold. I work for BICC, the Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. Yeah, I mean, as you're very well aware, sort of we are currently seeing the fastest evolving displacement crisis since the Second World War, and it's really devastating and heartbreaking to see that 3.9 million people were forced to flee already from the war in Ukraine. They, like 82 million people across the globe, have been forced to leave their homes behind and to separate from their families. They lost loved ones and their livelihoods, their educations and careers are interrupted. And even after refugees find protection, many continue to remain vulnerable, aid-dependent, and legally insecure. The experience of being displaced can go on for many years, even though each person has the potential to start anew. Our point is that displaced people are rarely given the chance to do so. Our policy brief, People First, makes the case for a paradigm shift towards a people-centered approach to displacement policy that grants refugees more freedoms, including the freedom to move, offers legal and livelihood security, and builds upon each person's ability and potential. So we're asking G7 countries to lead in offering solutions, for example, by accelerating implementation of the two global compacts, the Compact on Refugees and the Compact on Safe, Legally and Secure Migration. We ask them to offer education, work, and apprenticeship opportunities to displaced people so they can make use of the talents and skills, to leverage the power of family networks so it's easier for displaced people to reunite and support one another, and to scale up support for the most vulnerable individuals through aid and development cooperation in host countries, and by substantially also expanding resettlement schemes. The political reaction to the current Ukraine crisis around the world is quite encouraging. So for the first time in Europe, the Temporary Protection Directive was activated, showing that it's possible to think and act differently in displacement emergencies when there's political will. And the G7 countries can make this change a new normal. And so we believe that really this people-centered approach is the future of international protection. So this was my prepared statement. As you can tell, what I wanted to add after listening to your summary of your proposals, Sebastian and Christian, is that in general, like the implementation of the global compacts has a great leverage potential for the G7 states to do not only a lot for displaced people themselves and for migrants, but it can be used as a leverage for development. You're well aware sort of that remittances are much higher than foreign direct investments and ODA. And I think this potential of the people themselves must be further utilized. And if governments continue to fight migration and migrants, this is so counterproductive, and this also blocks the potential of remittances also channeled through families and people's own networks to the places and to people who need the support the most. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Benjamin, especially also for the last part of your intervention. So, and I think, I guess probably everybody will agree that, say, the displacement issue, refugee issue really needs to be tackled in a complete different way. Maybe we have a kind of a game changer now, but let's see, we don't know. Yeah, we are still in early stages, about 3.9 millions, and let's see whether we can really bring this into our, say, long-term thinking, and not just we are now nice to refugees for 3 months or so. Yeah, this will not be sufficient, and we should all be aware that it needs much more, and it needs a change of a system. So I fully with you. Thank you very much. So then next one and last one here on my list is Georgios, please.
Thank you again, Christian. We have a paper here that we have submitted, policy brief with my colleague Haris Gleckman. We are both from the Foundation for Global Governance Sustainability, and we have a proposal for a Global Resilience Council as a UN Security Council for human security issues like climate change and pandemics. And what we mean by that's very specific, but what we want to say to the G7 is that they bring together key members of the international community. They want often to speak as the international community. Several of them are founding members of the United Nations and the United Nations system and main financial contributors. So they have a responsibility and an interest to play a role in the direction of improving the global governance system that is now proving again weak to deal with things, with crises like the one in Ukraine, for example, but even with the pandemic. So our proposal is that we can turn towards more positive direction the discussion if we can propose a focus on human security, which means addressing more effectively common challenges like the climate crisis, pandemics, food insecurity that's coming for everybody and other things like that in another context that is not compromised by the geopolitical differences and the veto power, etc. We call it a Global Resilience Council, this intergovernmental place, which should also have a very close connection to non-state actors, like we heard before, sub-state, local authorities, etc., but also the scientific community, the private sector, all kinds of civil society organizations who can be more engaged in this in a more planned way from the start. So we think that this would complete, in a way, the process that started with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and would show that the G7 are supportive of the broad framework of our common agenda report of the Secretary General, which is leading to the Summit of the Future in 2023. I think you mentioned it also in the presentation of the co-chairs of this task force. So you want to refer to 2023. It may map the road for beyond 2030, but also a way to keep the global governance system relevant and focused on positive also issues, non-military threats that can really bring together even adversaries in current conflicts to think together about overcoming fragmentation, because there are organs now dealing with climate, dealing with the pandemic, but they are in their own specialized caucus and they don't bring along the whole capacities of the multilateral system and of other non-state actors. So when we talk also about the climate group, etc., these are the side events of the UNFCCC, how they can be better organized and people held accountable to what they promise to really have implementation on the ground through a body like that we would call Global Resilience Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgios. Yeah, a great idea. I hope it will get traction and wherever. So for the UN or for the G20 and even for the GSS, I think this might be something we have to keep in mind, and it's very, very closely related, at least as I see it, with the big transformations we anyway have. And of course, it will also be a reaction to what we see right now and how we can probably have some more resilience mechanisms in the long run. It is also probably linkable to the foresight crew, because this is also what you would need for that, to be looking a bit behind the curtain, as difficult as it is. So thank you very much. I think this was great from all of you. You're very disciplined. So I really give you a big applause for that. We will look into the chat, and if there is no more to be said for today, of course, we will get together in this way or another soon. I would at least not forget about John. That's here's just Sebastian and me, but of course there is a third co-chair, John MacArthur, who also did here great work on input. And so maybe he has now to listen via the stream. And I have made our joint appraisal, an appraisal to you all in the call. I hope for good cooperation, upcoming ELMAO Summit, G7 Summit, and we will be in touch. And we don't be shy to give us a call, to send us a mail. And of course, we will also come back, as Sebastian already promised. We will send you then the reworked, little bit slightly reworked PowerPoint. Sebastian, over to you, please.
No, thanks. I was trying to answer to Marianne in the chat. Marianne was asking, when will you share the first draft and offer opportunity for comment? And I think we need to digest your suggestions today and then send you something for comment later on. But of course, any comments that you already have and didn't have the opportunity to mention are going to be extremely useful. The other thing that I think we need also to look at is the fact that some of the suggestions we make in our issue paper are very converging with the ones that I heard from the task force on economic recovery. And I think that's not overlap. It's rather important, because that is looking at convergences between what we will tell to the Foreign Affairs and Development Ministry and what they will tell to the Finance Ministry. On the other hand, I see also from many of the policy briefs proposals, for instance, on WTO reform, that they could also fit in other task forces. And I think this is where we will try to ensure also that your ideas are pushed through all task force possible by any means necessary, I was going to say, so that they can reach consensus. So thanks a lot for all those comments, very well taken. And as you see, we've tried to connect your policy briefs as much as we could with the issue paper, but not for all of them. Thanks a lot. Do we have to close now at 45?
I think we can close now. I think I look to the technical support, and thanks to all of you. Bye-bye. See you next